Welcome to Quietly Made. I am so glad you have found your way here tonight. This is a space for the curious and the weary, a place where we explore the vast, invisible infrastructures of our world, while giving your mind the permission it needs to simply rest. Before we begin, I invite you to join our community by subscribing and leaving a comment. I often wonder where these stories find you tonight. If you feel inclined, please leave a comment sharing what part of the world you are in and the hour you are settling into sleep. It is a small way for us to feel the quiet connection of this community, scattered across different time zones, but sharing this same moment of rest. If you fall asleep, that is exactly what should happen. You are safe here. You can always come back tomorrow and pick up exactly where you left off. Adjust your pillow. Take a deep, slow breath in and let it out. Let your mind drift as we begin. Before there were encrypted ledgers and decentralized networks, before the first block was ever mined, there existed a quieter kind of discontent. Not the loud protests in city squares, but something softer, a low hum of frustration felt in bank lobbies with their velvet ropes and numbered tickets, in the delay between continents when money moved slower than the speed of conversation, in the realization that a paper promise could be worth everything one day and dissolve into nothing the next. This discontent didn't announce itself. It accumulated in the margins of financial statements, in the fine print of transaction fees, in the 3-day waiting periods that turned urgent needs into patient suffering. The traditional systems had served well enough for generations. Marble columns supported the weight of vaulted ceilings. Brass fixtures gleamed under regulated lighting. Tellers counted bills with practiced fingers, the paper making that distinct shuffle-snap sound as it moved from stack to stack. The whole architecture of money rested on intermediaries, institutions that stood between people and their ability to transact, gatekeepers who validated, who verified, who charged for the privilege of passage. These weren't villains in the story. They were simply the infrastructure that had evolved over centuries, each layer adding its own friction, its own delay, its own cost. But friction, when applied consistently over time, generates heat. The merchant waiting 5 business days for an international payment felt it. The immigrant sending portions of wages across borders, watching fees consume significant percentages, felt it. The person whose account could be frozen by decisions made in distant offices, whose access to their own resources depended on operating hours and approval processes, felt it. This wasn't about ideology at first. It was about the physics of how money moved, or more accurately, how it didn't move, how it got stuck in the machinery of verification and trust. Trust itself had become expensive. Every transaction required a third party to confirm that value existed, that it could be transferred, that the transfer was legitimate. Banks trusted each other through complex webs of correspondence relationships. Currencies trusted each other through exchange rates that fluctuated with the confidence of markets. Individuals trusted institutions because there seemed to be no alternative, because the social contract of money required someone to maintain the ledger, to remember who owned what. to prevent the same dollar from being spent twice. The cost of this trust wasn't always visible, but it was real, embedded in every spread, every fee, every requirement to prove identity before accessing your own resources. Some observers began to ask different questions, not how to make the existing system more efficient, but whether the system itself could be reimagined. What if trust didn't require a central authority? What if verification could happen through mathematics rather than institutions? What if the ledger that tracked ownership could be maintained not by a single gatekeeper, but by a distributed network of participants, none of whom needed to trust each other individually because they could trust the process itself? These questions didn't have obvious answers. They lived in academic papers that most people would never read, in cryptographic discussions that seemed purely theoretical, in the imaginations of those who saw problems in the friction and wondered if there might be a fundamentally different approach. The infrastructure of traditional money had been built for a world of physical presence, of signatures on paper, of assets you could hold in your hand or lock in a vault. But the world had changed faster than the infrastructure. Communication happened at light speed through fiber optic cables. Information could be copied and transmitted instantly, yet money still moved like it had weight, like it needed armored trucks and clearinghouses, like the fact of a transaction had to be certified by institutions whose business hours reflected a pre-digital era. The gap between what technology made possible and what financial systems actually delivered grew wider each year. And in that gap, a different kind of thinking began to take shape. The technical possibility and the social need began to converge. What had been theoretical discussions in cryptography circles started to feel like potential solutions to real problems. The dissatisfaction with existing systems wasn't universal, but it was widespread enough, diverse enough, that it created an audience for different approaches. Not everyone needed an alternative to traditional banking, but enough people encountered enough friction in enough different contexts that the market for a new kind of money that could move like information, that didn't require institutional intermediaries, that couldn't be controlled by any single authority, began to seem not just technically interesting, but practically valuable. The idea of digital currency didn't emerge suddenly. It accumulated slowly through decades of experimentation, through attempts that failed in interesting ways, through theoretical frameworks that almost worked but couldn't quite solve all the necessary problems simultaneously. Long before the breakthrough that would eventually capture public attention, researchers and enthusiasts explored the boundaries of what cryptography and distributed systems might make possible. Their work happened in academic journals and mailing lists, in conversations among people who understood that money was ultimately just information, and that if information could be secured and transmitted digitally, perhaps money could too. The early attempts shared common challenges. Creating digital tokens was straightforward enough, just data representing value. But data could be copied perfectly and infinitely. A physical coin couldn't exist in two places at once. The metal itself prevented duplication. But a digital file containing the representation of a coin could be copied as easily as any other file. This was the fundamental problem: how to create digital scarcity in a medium where scarcity didn't naturally exist. How to ensure that when someone spent a digital token, they couldn't also keep a copy and spend it again. The double spend problem wasn't just a technical inconvenience, it was the core challenge that had to be solved for digital currency to be possible at all. Traditional digital payment systems solved double spending through centralization. A bank maintained the authoritative ledger. When you spent money, the bank subtracted it from your account and added it to someone else's. The bank's records were definitive because everyone agreed to trust the bank as the arbiter of truth. This worked, but it meant that digital money wasn't truly digital in a native sense. It was just a digital representation of relationships managed by a central authority. The early digital currency concepts tried to preserve some advantages of physical cash: anonymity, direct transfer between parties, no requirement for third-party approval. But achieving these properties without a central authority proved extraordinarily difficult. Some early systems used cryptographic signatures to create tokens that could be verified as authentic without revealing the identity of the holder. The mathematics allowed for what seemed impossible: a way to prove you had the right to spend a token without revealing who you were. These systems approached the privacy properties of physical cash, where a dollar bill doesn't carry your name, where transactions happen directly between parties without institutional oversight. But they still required a central issuer to prevent double spending, someone who would mark tokens as spent and refuse to accept them again. The centralization might be minimal, might involve less surveillance than traditional banking, but it remained a necessary component. Other approaches explored distributed consensus, ways for multiple parties to agree on the state of a shared ledger without any single party being in control. The mathematics of Byzantine fault tolerance offered frameworks for reaching agreement even when some participants might be unreliable or malicious. But these systems typically required participants to be known and somewhat trusted, or they operated efficiently only at small scales. Applying them to a global currency system, open to anyone, resistant to manipulation by powerful actors, remained an unsolved problem. The pieces existed separately: digital signatures, hash functions, consensus mechanisms. But combining them into a working whole required insights that hadn't yet crystallized. The theoretical work happened in parallel with practical attempts. Some systems launched with real users, real merchants, real transactions. They demonstrated that people would use digital currency when it offered advantages over traditional payment methods: privacy, speed, lower fees. These properties attracted early adopters willing to tolerate technical complexity and uncertainty. But the centralization inherent in these systems made them vulnerable. Operators could be pressured by authorities, could be hacked, could simply fail to maintain the infrastructure. Without the institutional protections and regulations that govern traditional financial services, These early experiments often collapsed, taking user funds with them. The failures were instructive. Each attempt revealed constraints, showed which problems were harder than they appeared, demonstrated that creating money wasn't just a technical challenge, but a social and economic one. Currency requires trust, requires a shared belief that the tokens will retain value, that they'll be accepted by others, that the system will continue to function. Building that trust without the backing of governments or established institutions proved difficult. Even when the technology worked, adoption remained limited. Network effects favored existing money. Convincing merchants to accept a new currency required convincing customers to use it, and vice versa. Yet, the conceptual foundation deepened with each iteration. The community of researchers and developers interested in cryptographic currency remained small but committed, understanding that they were working on problems that might not have immediate solutions, but that felt increasingly important. The digital transformation of commerce accelerated. More transactions happened online. More value existed in purely digital forms. The infrastructure of traditional finance strained to adapt, layering new technologies onto old assumptions, creating systems that were digital on the surface but analog in their fundamental architecture. In certain circles, the conversation shifted from whether digital currency was possible to what specific properties it needed to succeed. Privacy mattered to some. The ability to transact without surveillance, without creating permanent records of every purchase and payment. For others, resistance to censorship was paramount, ensuring that no authority could prevent transactions between willing parties, could freeze accounts, could restrict access based on political or social criteria. Still others focused on the monetary policy question. Who would control the supply of this digital money, and by what rules would new units be created or removed from circulation? These weren't just technical specifications. They were philosophical choices that would shape the nature of the system. A currency controlled by a central authority could adjust its supply in response to economic conditions, could implement policies designed to stabilize value or stimulate activity. But it would also be vulnerable to mismanagement, to political pressure, to the age-old temptation to create more money to solve short-term problems. A currency with a fixed supply determined by algorithmic rules would be free from manipulation, but might lack the flexibility that modern economies seem to require. Each design choice involved trade-offs, and the early conceptual work explored these trade-offs extensively. The cryptographic tools continued to advance. Digital signatures became more sophisticated, allowing for complex spending conditions, for multi-party authorization, for time-locked transactions that couldn't be executed until certain conditions were met. Hash functions proved increasingly useful, not just for encryption, but for creating tamper-evident records, for linking pieces of data together in ways that would reveal any attempt at alteration. The concept of a hash chain emerged, a sequence of data blocks where each block contained the hash of the previous block, creating a structure where changing any historical data would break the chain, would be immediately detectable. This structural insight, that data could be organized in a way that made its history verifiable and immutable, would prove crucial. It suggested a solution to one of the fundamental problems of distributed consensus: how to maintain a shared history when participants might disagree about what happened and in what order. If the history could be structured so that changing it required not just altering one record, but breaking a chain of cryptographic connections, the cost of rewriting the past could be made prohibitively high. The insight didn't immediately solve all problems, but it offered a direction, a way that mathematical properties could substitute for institutional authority. The social vision evolved alongside the technical exploration. Some saw digital currency as a tool for individual liberty, a way to transact freely without permission from banks or governments. Others viewed it as a pragmatic solution to inefficiencies in the global financial system, a way to reduce friction and expand access. Still others imagined it as the foundation for new forms of economic organization, for systems that could encode rules and enforce them automatically through code rather than through institutions and laws. These visions sometimes aligned, sometimes conflicted, but they all shared a sense that money could be reimagined, that the digital revolution shouldn't stop at the door of finance. The mailing lists where these ideas circulated operated in relative obscurity. The discussions were technical, dense with mathematics and computer science, accessible mainly to specialists. But within that specialist community, a kind of accumulation was happening. Each proposed system built on previous attempts. Each failure refined the understanding of what was necessary. The community developed a shared vocabulary, a common framework for thinking about the properties that digital currency needed. They understood the double spend problem, the trade-offs between privacy and auditability, the challenges of distributed consensus, the importance of incentive structures that would motivate participation and honest behavior. By the time all the pieces were ready to be assembled into something genuinely new, the groundwork had been laid by years of incremental progress. The breakthrough, when it came, wouldn't emerge from a vacuum. It would synthesize decades of cryptographic research, distributed systems theory, economic thinking, and practical experimentation. It would combine existing tools in a novel configuration, solving problems that individually had been addressed, but that together had seemed intractable. The early concepts, even those that failed, even those that never launched beyond white papers and prototypes, created the context in which something more durable could finally take shape. The breakthrough arrived quietly, announced not with fanfare, but with a technical paper posted to an obscure mailing list. The document was precise, methodical, written in the language of computer science and cryptography. It described a system that combined familiar elements, digital signatures, hash functions, peer-to-peer networks, in a configuration that solved problems others had approached but not fully resolved. The innovation wasn't in any single component, but in how they fit together, in the elegance of the overall architecture, in the recognition that economic incentives could substitute for institutional trust. At the heart of the system was a distributed ledger, a record of all transactions maintained not by a central authority, but by the network itself. Every participant could hold a copy of this ledger, could verify its accuracy independently, could see the complete history of every unit of currency from its creation to its current ownership. This transparency seemed to contradict privacy, but the design preserved pseudonymity. Addresses were strings of characters not obviously linked to real identities. You could see that address A sent value to address B, but without additional information, you couldn't know who controlled those addresses. The ledger was organized into blocks, each containing a batch of transactions along with a cryptographic reference to the previous block. This created the chain structure that earlier work had suggested, where altering historical data became computationally impractical because it would require recalculating every subsequent block. But the key innovation was in how new blocks were added, how the network reached consensus about which transactions were valid and in what order they occurred. The solution involved proof of work, a requirement that adding a block to the chain required solving a difficult computational puzzle. This puzzle wasn't difficult in the sense of requiring intelligence or insight. It was difficult in the sense of requiring brute computational force, trying millions or billions of random solutions until one happened to produce a result with specific mathematical properties. The difficulty could be adjusted to ensure that blocks were added at a predictable average rate, regardless of how much total computational power was devoted to the task. And crucially, finding a solution required enormous effort, but verifying that a solution was correct required almost no effort at all. This asymmetry meant that honest participants could quickly check each other's work while making it prohibitively expensive to generate fraudulent history. The economic incentive came in the form of rewards for those who successfully added blocks to the chain. New currency was created, with each block awarded to whoever solved the computational puzzle. This served multiple purposes simultaneously. It provided a mechanism for distributing the initial supply of currency without a central issuer. It created an incentive for participants to contribute computational resources to maintaining the network, and it made attacking the system expensive. To rewrite history, you would need to outcompute all the honest participants combined, solving not just one puzzle, but recreating an entire chain of them. The elegance of this design revealed itself slowly. At first glance, it seemed wasteful to require vast amounts of computation just to add transactions to a ledger. But the computation wasn't purposeless. It was the mechanism that made the system resistant to manipulation, without requiring participants to trust each other or defer to a central authority. The energy expended in solving these puzzles was the cost of consensus, the price of maintaining a shared truth in a distributed system where anyone could participate and no one was in charge. The system launched with minimal infrastructure. The initial software was simple, almost crude. The network consisted of a handful of computers running the protocol, slowly building the chain of blocks one at a time. The currency had no exchange rate, no market value, no place in the broader economy. It existed primarily as a proof of concept, a demonstration that the theoretical framework described in the paper could actually function in practice. The early participants were enthusiasts, people who understood the technical achievement even if they couldn't predict its eventual significance. For months, the network operated in near obscurity. Blocks were added regularly, the difficulty adjusting automatically as participants joined or left. The currency accumulated in wallets, software that managed cryptographic keys, that constructed and signed transactions, that interfaced with the network to broadcast payments and receive confirmations. These wallets were basic, offering functionality without polish, tools for people who could tolerate rough edges in exchange for participating in something genuinely novel. The first transactions were experiments, people sending small amounts to each other to verify that the system worked, that value could move from one address to another without intermediaries, that the network could validate and record these movements reliably. There was something almost magical about it. You could send money to someone anywhere in the world by simply broadcasting a transaction to the network, and within minutes or hours, that transaction would be confirmed, incorporated into a block, made permanent in the shared ledger that everyone could verify. The early community formed around mailing lists and forums, spaces where participants discussed technical details, reported bugs, proposed improvements. The conversation was collaborative, open source in spirit, driven by people who saw themselves as building infrastructure rather than launching a product. They shared code, debugged problems together, explored the implications of the design choices embedded in the system. Some ran network nodes simply to support the infrastructure. Others experimented with mining, devoting computational resources to solving the puzzles that added blocks, collecting the newly created currency as a reward. Mining in those early days required no specialized equipment. An ordinary computer could participate, could occasionally solve a block, and receive the reward. The difficulty was low because the total computational power of the network was low. This accessibility meant that the initial distribution of currency was relatively broad. Anyone with technical knowledge and a computer could accumulate some units simply by running the software. There was no market price yet, no way to exchange this digital currency for traditional money. So the mining rewards had no obvious monetary value. They represented participation, proof that the system functioned, tokens in an experiment whose outcome remained uncertain, but value emerged gradually through use and belief. The first recorded exchange of the currency for physical goods happened informally, a transaction that established a price point, not through markets, but through individual agreement. Someone offered currency in exchange for food delivered. Someone else accepted. The exchange rate was arbitrary, negotiated between two parties, but it represented a threshold, the transition from pure experiment to actual medium of exchange, however limited. Other informal trades followed, mostly within the community of participants who understood what the currency was and how it worked. The technical infrastructure continued to develop. The software improved, becoming more reliable, adding features that made it easier to use. More people began running nodes, strengthening the network, making it more resilient against failure or attack. The chain grew longer, the history deeper, the computational investment required to rewrite that history more daunting. Each block added another layer of security, another link in the cryptographic chain that bound the present to the past, making the ledger increasingly immutable through sheer accumulated proof of work. The community remained small but intensely engaged. These were people who understood that they were participating in something with potentially profound implications, even if those implications weren't yet clear. They saw past the rough edges, past the limited adoption, past the absence of any obvious path to mainstream acceptance. What they saw was a working system that achieved something previously thought impossible: truly decentralized digital currency, money that existed without banks, without governments, without any central authority to maintain or control it. The accumulation during this period was not primarily of value in the monetary sense. It was an accumulation of proof that the system worked, that the design was sound, that the theoretical framework could sustain itself in the messy reality of actual implementation. It was an accumulation of knowledge among participants who learned how to use the tools, how to secure their keys, how to verify transactions. It was an accumulation of computational work, each solved puzzle adding to the total investment embedded in the blockchain, making the system harder to attack or corrupt. The process of maintaining the network involved machinery, both digital and physical. Computers hummed in spare rooms and basements, their processors cycling through calculations at speeds measured in millions of operations per second. The work was repetitive, mechanical in its nature, testing random values against a target, checking if the result met the required criteria, discarding failures and trying again. The computers didn't understand what they were doing. They simply executed instructions, transformed inputs into outputs through fixed mathematical operations, participated in a global computation without awareness or intent. Each mining attempt began with gathering unconfirmed transactions from the network. These transactions floated in a shared pool, broadcast by users who wanted to send value from one address to another. The mining software selected a batch of these transactions, verified that they were valid, that the signatures were correct, that the sending addresses actually controlled the claimed amounts, that no attempt was being made to spend the same funds twice. Valid transactions were assembled into a candidate block, a data structure that also contained the hash of the most recent confirmed block, linking the new block to the existing chain. Then came the puzzle solving itself. The software added a random number to the block data and computed its hash, a fixed length string of characters generated through an algorithm that converted any input into an output that appeared random but was actually deterministic. The same input always produced the same hash, but changing even a single bit of the input would produce a completely different hash in ways that couldn't be predicted without actually computing it. The hash of the block had to meet specific criteria, had to contain a certain number of leading zeros. Most random numbers didn't produce qualifying hashes. The computer tried one, found it didn't work, tried another, tried billions more. The mechanical nature of this work couldn't be shortcut through cleverness or insight. You couldn't reason your way to a solution. You couldn't apply intelligence to reduce the search space. The only approach was brute force, testing possibilities until you found one that worked. This made the puzzle democratic in a sense. It didn't favor genius over diligence. What mattered was computational power, the ability to test many possibilities quickly. A more powerful computer could try more combinations per second, but it was still engaged in the same fundamentally random search as every other participant. When a valid solution was finally found, the result was broadcast to the network. Other nodes received this newly mined block, verified its hash, met the required criteria, checked that all the transactions it contained were valid, confirmed that it properly referenced the previous block. If everything checked out, nodes added this block to their copy of the chain, updated their view of which transactions had been confirmed, and began working on the next block. The miner who found the solution received the reward, newly created currency that didn't exist before, plus any fees that transaction senders had chosen to include as incentives for quick processing. This mechanical process created a kind of clock for the system. Blocks arrived at roughly predictable intervals, not perfectly regular, but averaging out over time. The protocol adjusted the difficulty of the puzzle every so often, examining how quickly recent blocks had been found. If blocks were coming too fast, difficulty increased, requiring more leading zeros in the hash, making valid solutions rarer. If blocks were too slow, difficulty decreased. This feedback mechanism kept the pace roughly steady, even as the total computational power of the network fluctuated, even as more miners joined or existing ones shut down their operations. The machinery evolved as the system grew. Early miners used standard processors, the same chips that ran word processors and web browsers. These CPUs were general purpose, capable of many different computational tasks, but not optimized for any particular one. As mining became more competitive, participants discovered that graphics processors, chips designed for rendering images and video, could perform the hash calculations much more efficiently. GPUs could execute many simple operations in parallel, perfect for the embarrassingly parallel task of testing millions of hash possibilities simultaneously. The shift to graphics processors changed the economics of mining. What had been accessible to anyone with a computer became an activity that favored those willing to invest in specialized hardware. The difficulty adjusted upward as more powerful machines joined the network, maintaining the target block time but raising the computational threshold required to compete. Individual miners began pooling resources, combining their processing power and sharing rewards proportionally. These pools coordinated the work, distributing different ranges of random numbers to different participants, ensuring no duplication of effort, collecting solutions, and distributing payouts. The pools introduced a new layer of coordination into the supposedly decentralized system. Pool operators became intermediaries, not in the sense of controlling funds or transactions, but in organizing collective mining efforts. Participants had to trust that pools would distribute rewards fairly, that the reported shares of work matched reality, that payouts would arrive as promised. Most pools operated honestly, understanding that their reputation was their primary asset. But the concentration of mining into pools meant that a small number of entities controlled significant fractions of the total computational power, raising questions about how decentralized the system truly was. The hardware arms race continued. Engineers designed chips specifically for computing hashes, application-specific integrated circuits that did one thing extraordinarily well. These ASICs couldn't run general software or process graphics. They were purpose-built for the single task of solving proof-of-work puzzles. They performed this task orders of magnitude more efficiently than general-purpose processors, consuming less power per hash, generating less heat, occupying less space. Mining operations that once fit on a desktop now filled warehouses, racks of specialized chips humming in climate-controlled facilities. The electricity consumption became significant. All this computational work required power to run the chips, to cool the facilities, to maintain the infrastructure. Critics pointed to the energy expenditure as wasteful, vast amounts of electricity devoted to solving puzzles that had no intrinsic value beyond securing the network. Supporters countered that the energy wasn't wasted if it achieved something valuable, that securing a global financial network required resources, that traditional banking infrastructure also consumed enormous energy when you counted all the branches, servers, armored trucks, and administrative facilities. The mechanical process of mining created a physical connection to what was otherwise a purely digital system. The blockchain existed as data, as bits in storage and packets on networks, but maintaining it required real machines in real locations, consuming real electricity, generating real heat. This physicality grounded the system in ways that might not have been initially obvious. You couldn't attack the network without deploying actual computational resources. You couldn't rewrite history without expending actual energy. The digital currency was secured not just by mathematics, but by the physical reality of the machines that perform those mathematical operations. The geographic distribution of mining operations followed economic logic. They concentrated in regions with cheap electricity, areas with surplus hydroelectric capacity, locations with subsidized power, jurisdictions with favorable regulatory environments. This created strange dynamics where the security of a global digital currency network depended partly on the local economics of electricity generation in specific regions. A new dam coming online somewhere could shift the geography of mining. A change in energy policy could affect the network's security profile. The machinery of the system extended beyond mining to the nodes that validated and relayed transactions. These nodes didn't compete to solve puzzles, didn't receive block rewards. They simply maintained copies of the blockchain, verified that new blocks met the protocol's rules, forwarded valid transactions to their peers. Running a node required resources, storage for the growing blockchain, bandwidth for relaying data, computational power for verification, but modest resources compared to mining. Anyone could run a node, could independently verify the state of the network, could participate in consensus without needing specialized hardware. This distinction between mining and validation was crucial to the system's design. Mining added new blocks, but all participants validated whether those blocks were legitimate. A miner who included invalid transactions or violated protocol rules would see their block rejected by the network, wasting the computational effort that found the solution. The validation nodes enforced the consensus rules, ensuring that mining power alone couldn't override the agreed-upon protocol. This created a balance, a separation between the power to produce blocks and the power to decide which blocks were valid. The mechanical aspects of the system, the hardware, the electricity, the continuous computation, formed the foundation on which everything else rested. The economic value, the transactions, the applications, all depended on this underlying machinery continuing to function, on miners continuing to compete, on nodes continuing to validate, on the proof of work chain continuing to grow. The machinery was both elegant in its simplicity and brutal in its demands, requiring constant expenditure of resources to maintain security, to preserve the shared truth encoded in the blockchain. As the network matured, patterns of use began to crystallize into conventions. The early chaos of experimentation gave way to more structured practices, to shared understandings about how the system should be used, how transactions should be formatted, how addresses should be generated. These standards emerged partly from technical necessity. Software needed to interoperate. Wallets from different developers needed to handle the same currency. And partly from social consensus, from the community collectively deciding on best practices that would make the system more reliable and accessible. The wallet software became increasingly sophisticated. Early versions required users to manage raw cryptographic keys, long strings of characters that represented ownership and control. Losing a key meant losing access to the associated funds permanently. There was no password reset, no customer service to call, no institutional backup. The responsibility for security rested entirely with the user, a departure from traditional banking, where the institution assumed liability for unauthorized transactions. This unforgiving nature reflected the system's design philosophy. No central authority meant no one to reverse mistakes or recover lost credentials. Developers created hierarchical, deterministic wallets that could generate multiple addresses from a single seed phrase, a sequence of common words that could be written down and used to regenerate all keys if the original wallet was lost. This made backup simpler, reduced the risk of permanent loss, but still required users to protect the seed phrase with the same care they would protect cash. The words became the bearer instrument, the physical object that represented control over digital value. Store them securely and you maintained access. Lose them or allow them to be seen by others and the funds could disappear. Transaction formats standardized around common patterns. Most transactions were simple transfers from one address to another, but the protocol allowed for more complex arrangements. Multi-signature transactions required multiple keys to authorize spending, enabling shared control or escrow arrangements. Time-locked transactions couldn't be broadcast until a certain block height or timestamp, allowing for delayed payments or more sophisticated smart contracts. These features existed from early on, but took time to be widely implemented in user-facing software. The block size became a point of standardization and debate. Each block could only contain a limited amount of transaction data, creating an effective ceiling on how many transactions the network could process per unit of time. This limit was originally intended as a temporary anti-spam measure, a way to prevent malicious actors from bloating the blockchain with useless data. But as usage grew, the limit began to bind, creating a bottleneck where transaction demand exceeded the network's capacity to process them all quickly. This capacity constraint led to the development of fee markets. When more transactions competed for inclusion in blocks than space was available, miners prioritized those offering higher fees. Users who wanted fast confirmation could attach larger fees to incentivize miners to include their transactions in the next block. Those willing to wait could use minimal fees and eventually be processed when demand slackened. This market mechanism for allocating scarce block space was elegant in theory, but created friction for users accustomed to predictable costs. The standardization extended to how the system interfaced with traditional finance. Exchange services emerged to facilitate conversion between digital currency and government-issued money. These exchanges operated as centralized businesses, holding both types of currency, allowing users to deposit one and withdraw the other. They required traditional banking relationships, compliance with financial regulations, systems for verifying user identities. In serving as bridges between the decentralized currency network and centralized financial infrastructure, they became points of centralization themselves. Entities that could be regulated, could be shut down, could fail or be compromised. The exchange infrastructure developed its own standards and practices. Different platforms offered different features. Some specialized in high-volume trading with sophisticated order types. Others focused on simple buying and selling for newcomers. Price discovery happened through these markets, through the continuous auction of bids and offers, through arbitrage between exchanges that kept prices roughly aligned. The exchange rate became real-time data, charts showing the currency's value fluctuating minute by minute as traders reacted to news, to technical analysis, to speculation about future adoption. Security practices standardized around protecting private keys. Cold storage, keeping keys on devices never connected to the internet. became the recommended approach for large holdings. Hardware wallets emerged, specialized devices that could sign transactions without exposing keys to potentially compromised computers. Multi-signature wallets required keys stored in different locations to authorize spending, so that compromise of any single key wasn't sufficient for theft. These practices reflected hard lessons learned from hacks and thefts, from millions in value lost to malware and social engineering. The protocol itself underwent limited but significant standardization efforts. The core rules governing what constituted a valid transaction, a valid block, remained mostly stable. Changing them required convincing the majority of the network to adopt modified software. But improvements could be layered on top through soft forks, changes that old software would accept even if it didn't fully understand the new features. This allowed for gradual enhancement without requiring universal coordination, though significant changes still generated intense debate within the community. Documentation standards improved as more people sought to understand and use the system. Technical specifications became clearer, tutorial content proliferated, explanatory resources emerged for those without deep cryptographic knowledge. The learning curve remained steep. Understanding how to use the system securely required grasping concepts foreign to most people's experience with money. But the path to competence became more navigable than in the early days when only specialists could participate. Measurement standards developed for discussing the currency. The base unit was divisible to 8 decimal places, allowing for very small transactions, but most discussion happened in whole units or common fractions. Mining difficulty was expressed in standardized metrics, hash rates measured in operations per second, network statistics tracked and published by various monitoring services. These measurements made the system's state more legible, more amenable to analysis and comparison over time. Regulatory approaches began to standardize across jurisdictions as governments grappled with how to treat this new form of value. Some classified it as property for tax purposes, requiring capital gains reporting on transactions. Others regulated exchanges as money transmitters, imposing licensing requirements and compliance obligations. The lack of global coordination meant that the same transaction might be treated differently depending on the participants' locations, creating complexity for those operating across borders. The social standardization proved as important as the technical. Communities developed norms about what constituted responsible use, about disclosure of conflicts of interest, about how to discuss the system with newcomers. Educational efforts emphasized understanding the risks, the irreversibility of transactions, the importance of personal responsibility for security. These norms couldn't be enforced through code, but through social pressure, through reputation effects, through the collective understanding that the system's success depended on users understanding what they were doing. Standards for measuring adoption emerged: transaction volume, number of addresses with balances, hash rate of the mining network, number of merchants accepting the currency. These metrics provided rough proxies for how widely the system was being used. None captured the full picture, but together they offered a sense of trajectory, of whether usage was expanding or contracting. whether the experiment was gaining momentum or stalling out. The standardization process was never complete, never final. New use cases emerged that required new standards. Scaling debates generated proposals for different approaches to increasing capacity. Privacy enhancements suggested modifications to how transactions were structured. But beneath the ongoing technical evolution, core patterns had stabilized sufficiently that the system felt less like a prototype and more like infrastructure, rough still, requiring expertise to use safely, but functional enough to support actual economic activity beyond pure experimentation. The shift from curiosity to commodity happened gradually, without announcement or ceremony. There was no moment when the digital currency suddenly became real in some fundamental sense. Instead, reality accumulated through thousands of small decisions, through merchants who began accepting it, through individuals who chose to hold portions of wealth in it, through services built around it. The transition was silent in that it didn't require permission or official recognition. It simply happened, one transaction at a time, one believer at a time, until the network effects became self-reinforcing. The first businesses to accept the currency were often ideologically aligned with its principles. Enterprises run by people who believed in decentralization, in financial privacy, in reducing dependence on traditional institutions. They displayed addresses where customers could send payment, integrated simple software to watch for incoming transactions, began denominating some prices in the new currency alongside or instead of traditional money. The transactions were clumsy at first, requiring both parties to understand the technology, to accept the volatility, to tolerate the friction of something genuinely novel. But the economic logic became compelling in certain contexts. For digital services especially, the currency offered advantages over traditional payment methods. No chargebacks meant no fraud risk from fraudulent payment reversals. International customers could pay as easily as domestic ones without currency conversion or international payment fees. The settlement was direct, without intermediaries taking percentages. For businesses operating on thin margins or serving global markets, these properties mattered enough to justify the complexity. The silent transition was visible in the growing number of addresses with non-zero balances, in the increasing transaction volume, in the steady climb of the exchange rate as more people wanted to acquire the currency than wanted to sell it. The price movements created their own momentum. Those who bought early and saw the value increase became advocates, convinced that they had discovered something important. Their advocacy brought in new participants whose purchases pushed the price higher, validating the earlier believers and creating new ones in a self-reinforcing cycle. Speculation became impossible to separate from legitimate use. Some held the currency because they believed in its long-term potential as money. Others held it because they believed the price would continue to rise regardless of its utility. The currency served both purposes simultaneously. It could be used for transactions and held as an investment. This dual nature created volatility, as speculative trading swamped the relatively small amount of actual commercial use. The price could swing dramatically in short periods, making it challenging to use as a stable medium of exchange, while simultaneously attracting traders drawn to the volatility itself. The infrastructure around the currency expanded quietly. Payment processors emerged to handle the technical details for merchants who wanted to accept it without managing the underlying technology themselves. These services could instantly convert received payments to traditional currency, eliminating the merchant's exposure to price volatility while still offering customers the option to pay with digital currency. The conversion happened invisibly, creating the user experience of acceptance while the merchant received stable, familiar money. Remittance became a genuine use case where the currency offered clear advantages. Workers in wealthy countries could send value to family in other nations with lower fees and faster settlement than traditional money transfer services. The recipients needed some way to convert the digital currency to local money. But informal markets emerged for this purpose. Local dealers who would trade digital currency for cash. The process remained cumbersome, but for those sending significant portions of income across borders regularly, the savings justified the effort. The transition touched different communities at different speeds. Technical communities adopted earlier, comfortable with the complexity and risks. Geographic regions with dysfunctional financial systems saw faster uptake, where the currency's volatility seemed mild compared to local currency instability. Younger demographics proved more willing to experiment, having less embedded commitment to traditional finance. The adoption pattern wasn't uniform, but fractal. Pockets of intense use, surrounded by vast areas of complete indifference. Media attention came in waves, often triggered by price movements. Stories about the currency appeared in technology publications first, then business media, eventually mainstream outlets. The coverage oscillated between breathless enthusiasm and skeptical dismissal, rarely capturing the nuanced reality of a genuinely innovative system that also had significant limitations. Each wave of attention brought new participants who had to recapitulate the learning process, had to discover through experience what the system could and couldn't do. The silent transition included the development of secondary markets and derivative instruments. Futures contracts allowed traders to bet on future prices without actually holding the currency. Options provided ways to hedge exposure or speculate on volatility. These financial instruments made the currency accessible to institutional investors who couldn't or wouldn't hold it directly, but wanted exposure to its price movements. The irony wasn't lost on observers. A currency designed to bypass traditional financial intermediation, spawning a whole ecosystem of intermediaries. The cultural meaning of holding the currency shifted during this period. Early on, it signaled technical sophistication and ideological commitment. As it became more accessible and well-known, it transformed into something else, a speculative bet for some, a political statement for others, a genuine tool for specific use cases for a subset of users. The diversity of motivations and use cases made it difficult to characterize what the currency was or who was using it. It was all of these things simultaneously, serving different purposes for different people. Trust in the system accumulated through reliability. The network continued to function. Blocks were added consistently. Transactions were processed. The protocol rules were maintained. Each day that passed without catastrophic failure, without the fatal flaw that skeptics expected, added to the empirical case that the system worked. This wasn't blind faith, but evidence-based confidence, the recognition that something operating continuously under adversarial conditions for years had proven a degree of robustness. The transition also revealed limitations. Transaction throughput remained constrained by block size limits. Confirmation times of 10 minutes or more made the currency impractical for point-of-sale retail transactions. The volatility undermined its use as a unit of account or stable store of value. Privacy was pseudonymous rather than truly anonymous. Sophisticated analysis could often link addresses to identities. Energy consumption for mining continued to grow, creating sustainability concerns. These weren't theoretical problems, but practical constraints that limited how and where the currency could be effectively used. Yet, within those constraints, genuine economic activity flourished. Online marketplaces accepted it. Service providers invoiced in it. Individuals used it to preserve wealth in unstable regions. Developers built applications on top of the underlying blockchain technology. The ecosystem expanded, not despite the limitations, but within them, finding use cases where the currency's properties, censorship resistance, programmability, global accessibility, mattered more than its drawbacks. The silent transition was perhaps most visible in the infrastructure investments. Data centers devoted to mining consumed megawatts of power. Developers dedicated careers to building tools and services. Investors allocated capital to businesses in the ecosystem. Traditional financial institutions began offering custody services, acknowledging demand from clients who wanted exposure but needed institutional-grade security. These investments represented belief expressed through resource allocation, through actual skin in the game rather than mere words. The transition transformed the currency from experiment to fixture without ever achieving the mainstream adoption its most enthusiastic advocates predicted. It remained difficult to use, volatile in value, misunderstood by most people. But it also became undeniably real, a functioning parallel financial system that processed billions in value, that operated continuously across borders, that proved the viability of the core concepts, even as debates continued about its ultimate destiny. Beneath the visible layer of transactions and price movements, a complex infrastructure took shape. This was the plumbing of the system, the technical scaffolding that that made everything else possible. It grew organically, without central planning, as different participants identified needs and built solutions. The infrastructure wasn't glamorous. It consisted of databases and APIs, monitoring services and node operators, wallet providers and block explorers. But it was essential, the foundation on which the more visible applications rested. Node operators maintained the backbone of the network. These weren't miners competing for rewards, but participants who simply ran software that validated and relayed transactions. Their nodes stored complete copies of the blockchain, growing larger with each passing day as blocks accumulated. The storage requirements increased steadily. What could once fit on a modest hard drive eventually required dedicated storage arrays. Bandwidth consumption grew proportionally as nodes constantly exchanged block and transaction data with peers. Operating a node became a meaningful technical and economic commitment. Yet thousands chose to do it anyway, motivated by various incentives. Some ran nodes to support the network, viewing it as a public good worth contributing to. Others operated them for business purposes. Exchanges and payment processors needed reliable access to blockchain data, needed to monitor for incoming transactions, needed to broadcast their customers' payments. Some individuals ran nodes for privacy, avoiding the need to query third-party services about their transactions. The diversity of motivations created a robust, distributed infrastructure resistant to any single point of failure. Block explorers emerged as essential tools for making the blockchain legible. These websites index the entire chain, allowing anyone to search for transactions, view address balances, examine block contents. They presented raw blockchain data through accessible interfaces, transforming cryptographic hashes and transaction structures into human-readable information. The explorers became the primary way most users interacted with the blockchain, checking confirmations, verifying payments, researching addresses. They were centralized services built on top of decentralized infrastructure, a pattern that would repeat throughout the ecosystem. Application programming interfaces standardized how software interacted with the network. Developers building wallets or merchant tools or analytical services needed consistent ways to query blockchain data, to construct and broadcast transactions, to monitor for confirmations. These APIs abstracted away the underlying complexity, providing simple commands that hid the intricate cryptographic and networking details. The standardization of these interfaces enabled a proliferation of applications, each building on the common infrastructure without needing to re-implement the fundamentals. Wallet services evolved into sophisticated platforms. The simplest wallets just managed keys and constructed basic transactions. More advanced versions offered features like address books, transaction labels, multi-signature coordination, integration with hardware security devices. Some wallets specialized in privacy, using techniques to obscure the links between addresses and transactions. Others prioritized ease of use, abstracting away technical details to create experiences closer to traditional banking apps. The diversity of wallet software meant users could choose implementations matching their priorities and technical sophistication. The infrastructure included services that existed at the boundary between the decentralized network and traditional systems. Exchanges needed banking relationships to accept deposits and process withdrawals of government currency. They operated order books, matching buyers and sellers, maintaining the market infrastructure where price discovery happened. The technical challenge of running an exchange was substantial, securing hot wallets that needed to process withdrawals quickly while protecting cold storage of the majority of holdings, preventing market manipulation, complying with evolving regulations across multiple jurisdictions. Custody services emerged for institutional participants who wanted exposure to the currency but couldn't manage the security challenges internally. These custodians specialized in protecting cryptographic keys, using combinations of hardware security modules, multi-signature architectures, and careful operational security. They provided insurance, audit trails, and institutional-grade risk management. The irony that a system designed to eliminate trusted third parties generated demand for trusted custodians wasn't lost on observers, but it reflected practical reality. Many participants valued the benefits of the currency while preferring to outsource the technical complexity. Mining pools built their own infrastructure to coordinate distributed computational effort. Pool servers aggregated work from thousands of miners, distributed assignments to ensure no duplication, validated submitted solutions, and calculated payouts. The largest pools operated globally distributed infrastructure to minimize latency, to handle the massive data flows of miners constantly requesting work and submitting results. They developed sophisticated monitoring to detect cheating, to identify broken miners submitting invalid work, to optimize the selection of transactions to including candidate blocks. Payment processors created bridges between merchants and the currency network. They generated unique addresses for each transaction, monitored the blockchain for incoming payments, sent notifications when transactions were confirmed, and optionally converted, received currency to traditional money immediately. This infrastructure made acceptance practical for merchants who didn't want to manage blockchain monitoring or key security themselves. The processors charged fees for this service, typically less than credit card processing fees, creating a sustainable business model while expanding the currency's utility. Analytics platforms emerged to make sense of blockchain data at scale. They tracked metrics like transaction volume, active addresses, exchange flows, mining pool distributions. Some specialized in identifying patterns, clustering addresses likely controlled by the same entity, tracing fund flows through the network. Others focused on market analysis, correlating blockchain activity with price movements. The transparency of the blockchain made all this analysis possible. Every transaction was visible to anyone who cared to look, but the scale required specialized infrastructure to process and index the data efficiently. The infrastructure included educational resources and documentation. Developers needed technical references for the protocol, guides for integrating with the network, examples of common patterns. Users needed tutorials on securing wallets, explanations of transaction fees, guidance on privacy best practices. The knowledge required to use the system safely was substantial, and the infrastructure for transmitting that knowledge, websites, forums, videos, written guides, became as important as the technical infrastructure itself. Network monitoring services provided real-time visibility into the system's health. They tracked node counts, measured network hash rate, monitored block times and difficulty adjustments, identified potential issues like transaction backlogs or unusual mining behavior. This monitoring wasn't built into the protocol, but emerged as infrastructure that made the network state more observable, that provided early warning of problems, that helped participants understand what was happening beyond their individual view of the blockchain. The development infrastructure supported continuous improvement of the core software and ecosystem tools. Version control repositories hosted the source code, allowing distributed collaboration on improvements and bug fixes. Testing frameworks verified that changes didn't break existing functionality. Discussion forums and technical mailing lists coordinated development efforts, debated proposed changes, built consensus around the direction of the protocol. This soft infrastructure of human coordination proved as crucial as the hard infrastructure of servers and software. The infrastructure emerged through decentralized effort, but created new centralizations. Popular block explorers became single points of failure for many users' ability to check transactions. Large exchanges concentrated trading volume and became systemic risks. Dominant mining pools controlled substantial fractions of network hash rate. The pattern repeated throughout: decentralization in the protocol layer, concentration in the service layer. The infrastructure reflected not pure decentralization, but a complex hybrid, combining distributed consensus with practical centralized services, where they provided better user experience or economic efficiency. The network existed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. It had no physical headquarters, no single location where operations occurred. Instead, it manifested as countless computers scattered across continents, connected through internet infrastructure, participating in a shared protocol. This distributed nature gave it unusual properties. It couldn't be shut down by raiding an office or blocking a specific server. Disrupting the network would require disrupting internet connectivity globally, or convincing the majority of participants to simultaneously cease operation. Neither seemed feasible, creating resilience through dispersion. The global connection meant that transactions crossed borders without crossing them. A payment from one address to another didn't pass through geographic space in any meaningful sense. Both addresses existed in the same abstract mathematical space, equally distant from or close to each other, regardless of where their owners sat physically. The blockchain didn't track location, didn't distinguish domestic from international transfers. All transactions were simply entries in the ledger, validated by the same rules, processed through the same mechanisms. Geography became irrelevant in a way it had never been for money before. This borderless quality created friction with regulatory systems that assumed money would respect territorial boundaries. Governments could regulate exchanges operating within their jurisdiction, could require identification of users converting to and from local currency. But they struggled to regulate the network itself, which existed outside any single jurisdiction's control. The result was a patchwork of different regulatory approaches, from outright prohibition to cautious acceptance to active encouragement, creating a complex landscape for participants trying to operate legally across multiple territories. The network's global reach enabled use cases that traditional finance served poorly. Microtransactions between parties in different countries, where traditional payment methods would charge fees exceeding the transaction value, became economically viable. Payments to places where banking infrastructure was limited or unstable found an alternative channel. Cross-border business arrangements could proceed without waiting for international wire transfers or dealing with correspondent banking relationships. The use cases weren't theoretical. They represented actual economic activity happening daily, value flowing through the network in patterns that didn't correspond to traditional trade or remittance flows. Time zones became irrelevant. The network operated continuously, processing transactions and mining blocks without pause for weekends, holidays, or business hours. There was no closing bell, no settlement delay, no waiting for markets to open. This continuous operation matched the rhythm of global commerce better than systems designed for a world where finance happened in office buildings during working hours. A transaction initiated during Asian business hours would be confirmed before European markets opened, processed by a global network that never slept. Language barriers persisted, but mattered less than they might have. The protocol itself was language agnostic. Addresses and transactions were strings of characters that required no translation. The human infrastructure around the network, documentation, forums, support, existed in many languages, created by communities worldwide who adapted the technology to their local contexts. The decentralized nature meant no single culture or linguistic group controlled the system, though English remained dominant in technical discussions simply because many developers shared it as a common language. The global distribution of mining created unexpected dependencies and relationships. Regions with cheap electricity became disproportionately important to network security, not through deliberate policy, but through economic gravity. The location of hydroelectric facilities or coal plants influenced where mining operations concentrated, which in turn affected where protocol influence accumulated. This created vulnerabilities. If a single region produced too large a fraction of the network's computational power, local events there could have global implications. The connection between participants who had never met would never meet demonstrated trust mechanisms that didn't require personal relationships or institutional intermediaries. Someone in one country could transact with someone in another without knowing anything about them beyond their address, confident that the network would validate and record the exchange accurately. This trust in process, rather than people or institutions, represented a fundamental shift from how economic relationships had traditionally been structured. Exchange rates between the digital currency and various government currencies created arbitrage opportunities and global markets. Price differences between exchanges in different countries drove trading activity, as participants bought where it was cheaper and sold where it was more expensive. This arbitrage helped maintain rough price consistency globally, while creating profit opportunities for those with access to multiple markets. The pattern resembled traditional foreign exchange markets, but operated with different mechanics, reflecting the unique properties of the underlying asset. Regulatory arbitrage emerged as participants located operations in jurisdictions with favorable treatment. Exchanges moved to territories with clear legal frameworks or light regulation. Mining operations sought out not just cheap electricity, but political environments unlikely to suddenly ban or heavily restrict their activity. This geographic optimization for regulatory and economic conditions created new patterns of where infrastructure concentrated, patterns that could shift as policies changed or new opportunities emerged elsewhere. The network connected not just individuals, but communities with distinct cultures and priorities. Some geographic regions emphasized privacy and political resistance. Others focused on speculation and trading. Still others approached it as a technological curiosity or potential business opportunity. These different cultural relationships with the technology coexisted within the same network, all using the same protocol, but ascribing different meanings and purposes to it. The global connection meant these diverse perspectives encountered each other in forums and markets, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes with significant friction. Crisis moments in specific regions demonstrated the network's potential as an escape valve from local financial systems. When capital controls were imposed, when currencies collapsed, when banking systems froze, some people turned to the digital currency as an alternative. The volumes were usually modest relative to total economic activity, but for individuals affected, the ability to hold value outside the local system could be significant. These use cases weren't anticipated in the original design, but emerged from the network's properties: global accessibility, resistance to confiscation, independence from any single nation's policies. The infrastructure for converting between digital and traditional currencies developed differently across regions. Some places had sophisticated exchanges with deep liquidity and institutional participation. Others relied on informal peer-to-peer markets, local dealers who would meet in person to exchange cash for digital currency. The variation reflected differences in regulatory environment, banking infrastructure, technical sophistication, and local demand. But collectively, These varied conversion mechanisms created a global web of on-ramps and off-ramps between the two monetary systems. Cultural differences influenced how the technology was perceived and adopted. In regions with strong traditions of gold as a store of value, the digital currency was often framed as digital gold, emphasizing its limited supply and potential as a hedge against inflation. In tech-forward cultures, it was positioned as innovation, as the future of finance. In politically unstable areas, the emphasis fell on its independence from government control. These weren't contradictory framings, but different facets of the same technology, each resonating in different contexts based on local needs and values. The global connection created challenges for coordinated action. Upgrading the protocol required convincing a distributed network of participants to adopt new software. Unlike a company that could push updates to all users simultaneously, the network's decentralized nature meant changes happened through voluntary adoption. This made the system resistant to unwanted changes, but also made coordinated improvements difficult. Significant upgrades required months or years of discussion, careful deployment strategies, and acceptance that some participants might never upgrade, potentially creating incompatible versions of the network. Beneath the technical mechanisms and economic activity lay philosophical questions about the nature of money, trust, and coordination. The system forced participants to confront assumptions usually taken for granted. What made something valuable? Who should control monetary policy? Whether trust required knowing the parties you transacted with. These weren't abstract philosophical puzzles, but practical questions with concrete implications for how the system operated and what purposes it could serve. The debate about intrinsic value surfaced repeatedly. Critics argued that the currency had no inherent worth, that it was valuable only because people agreed it was, that this made it fundamentally different from commodities like gold, with industrial uses, or government currencies backed by taxation authority. Supporters countered that all money was ultimately based on shared belief, that even gold's value came primarily from its monetary role rather than its industrial applications, that the currency's scarcity and utility as a medium of exchange gave it value in the same way these properties had historically given value to other forms of money. The question of governance proved equally fundamental. Traditional currencies had central banks that could adjust monetary policy in response to economic conditions. The digital currency had no such mechanism. Its supply schedule was determined by algorithmic rules that no one could unilaterally change. This was seen as a feature by those who distrusted centralized monetary authority, who believed that the temptation to inflate the currency for political purposes made central control inherently problematic. But it troubled others who saw monetary policy as a crucial tool for managing economic cycles, for responding to crises, for pursuing employment and growth objectives. Privacy emerged as both a philosophical principle and a practical concern. The pseudonymous nature of addresses meant transactions could be made without revealing identity. But the public nature of the blockchain meant all transactions were visible to anyone who cared to analyze them. This created tension between privacy advocates who wanted stronger anonymity guarantees and those who worried about facilitating illegal activity. The debate reflected deeper questions about financial privacy as a right versus transparency, as a tool for preventing crime and enforcing tax obligations. The concept of trustlessness, the idea that the system worked without requiring participants to trust each other or any central authority, became central to the philosophical framework. Transactions were validated through cryptography and consensus rather than through institutional guarantees. This shift from trust in people or organizations to trust in mathematics and protocols represented a fundamentally different approach to coordination. It suggested that certain kinds of social cooperation didn't require the traditional mechanisms of enforcement and verification. That properly designed systems could align incentives in ways that made honesty the most rational strategy. The libertarian influences on the system's design were obvious, but not universal among participants. Some embraced the currency specifically because it operated outside government control, viewing it as a tool for individual sovereignty and resistance to state power. Others appreciated the technical innovation while remaining agnostic or even opposed to the political philosophy. The system could support both perspectives simultaneously. It didn't require ideological alignment to use, only willingness to follow the protocol rules. Questions about fairness and distribution generated ongoing discussion. Those who acquired the currency early, when it was inexpensive or easily mined with ordinary computers, accumulated holdings that became enormously valuable as the price rose. This created a new class of wealthy individuals whose fortunes came not from traditional business success or inheritance, but from early participation in a technological experiment. Critics pointed to this concentration of wealth as problematic, as undermining claims that the system was more egalitarian than traditional finance. Defenders argued that early adopters took risks when others were skeptical, that their rewards reflected the value they helped create by supporting the network when its future was uncertain. The environmental implications raised philosophical questions about the relationship between digital systems and physical resources. The proof-of-work mechanism consumed real electricity, generated real heat, required real hardware. This physicality grounded what was otherwise an abstract system, but also created sustainability concerns. Defenders argued that securing a global financial network justified the energy expenditure. That much of the mining used surplus or renewable energy that would otherwise be wasted. Critics contended that any system requiring such enormous resource consumption for basic operation was fundamentally flawed, that more efficient alternatives should be pursued. The tension between immutability and justice created ethical dilemmas. The system's design made transactions irreversible, made the historical ledger effectively permanent. This prevented arbitrary changes, protected against censorship and confiscation. But it also meant mistakes couldn't be undone. Thefts couldn't be reversed through protocol-level intervention. When substantial amounts were stolen or sent to wrong addresses, the victims had no recourse except trying to convince the recipient to return the funds voluntarily. The philosophical question was whether this inflexibility represented a reasonable trade-off for the benefits of immutability or an unacceptable failure to account for human error and malice. Ideas about decentralization itself evolved through practical experience with the system. Pure decentralization proved elusive. Mining pools concentrated hash power, exchanges concentrated liquidity, development efforts concentrated around key contributors. But the system remained meaningfully decentralized in that no single entity could unilaterally control it. That meaningful participation remained open to anyone, that the core protocol resisted capture by special interests. The philosophical ideal of perfect decentralization gave way to a more nuanced understanding of decentralization as a spectrum, as a set of properties that could be optimized for different objectives. The relationship between code and law emerged as a key philosophical divide. Some held that code is law, that the rules encoded in the protocol were the only legitimate governance mechanism, that whatever the code allowed was permissible by definition. Others maintained that social and legal norms should still apply, that the system existed within broader society and couldn't claim exemption from ethical or legal obligations. These perspectives clashed particularly around questions of how to handle protocol bugs, disputed transactions, or behavior that was technically possible but socially harmful. The philosophy of personal responsibility permeated the system. Users were expected to secure their own keys, verify their own transactions, understand the risks they were taking. There was no customer service to call, no authority to appeal to if things went wrong. This aligned with values of individual sovereignty and self-reliance, but created barriers to adoption for those accustomed to institutional protections. The question of whether this was a feature or a bug divided the community. Some saw it as essential to the system's integrity, others as a practical limitation that needed to be addressed through better tools and education. Temporal perspectives shaped philosophical positions. Those focused on immediate utility worried about scalability limitations, transaction fees, confirmation times, practical barriers to using the currency for everyday commerce. Those with longer time horizons emphasized the system's potential to transform how value was stored and transferred globally, willing to tolerate current limitations in service of a vision that might take decades to fully realize. These different temporal orientations led to different assessments of the system's success and different priorities for development. The emergence of competing currencies based on similar principles raised questions about network effects and standardization. If the technology worked, why not multiple implementations with different design choices? But if the value came partly from network effects, more participants making the system more useful, did fragmentation undermine the whole enterprise? The question paralleled historical debates about monetary standards, about whether competing private currencies or unified national currencies better served economic needs. The digital context enabled experimentation at scales previously impossible, turning philosophical debates into empirical questions that could be tested through actual deployment. The trajectory ahead remained uncertain, clouded by the complexity of forces that would shape how the system evolved. Extrapolating from the past offered limited guidance. The factors that enabled early growth might not sustain continued expansion, and new challenges emerged at each stage of development. What seemed clear was that the system had established itself as more than a temporary phenomenon, that it would continue to exist in some form, serving some purposes, even if those purposes differed from what early advocates had imagined or what critics had feared. Scaling remained the most obvious technical challenge. The network's capacity to process transactions was fundamentally limited by design choices made when usage was minimal and different trade-offs seemed reasonable. Various proposals emerged for increasing throughput, larger blocks, more efficient transaction formats, secondary layers that handled most transactions off the main blockchain and only periodically settled to it. Each approach involved compromises, trading one set of properties for another, and the community struggled to reach consensus on which path forward best preserved the system's essential characteristics while enabling broader use. The development of layered architectures suggested one possible future where the base blockchain served as a settlement layer, a foundation on which other systems built. Payment channels allowed parties to transact repeatedly without recording every exchange on the blockchain, only periodically updating the main ledger with net balances. These second-layer solutions could potentially process vastly more transactions than the base layer while inheriting its security properties. But they introduce new complexity, new trust assumptions, new infrastructure requirements that might recreate some of the centralization the system was designed to avoid. Integration with traditional financial infrastructure seemed likely to continue, creating hybrid systems that combined elements of both worlds. Banks might custody the digital currency for clients who wanted exposure without managing keys themselves. Traditional payment networks might enable transactions denominated in digital currency. Regulatory frameworks would mature, creating clearer rules that reduced uncertainty for businesses and users. This integration would make the currency more accessible and useful, but might also dilute some of its distinctive properties, might subject it to the same constraints and controls that governed conventional finance. The competition from other digital currencies and from central bank digital currencies would shape the landscape. Governments, seeing the success of decentralized currency, might issue their own digital versions of national currencies, offering some benefits of digital money while maintaining state control. Private currencies with different design choices, emphasizing different trade-offs between privacy and transparency, between decentralization and efficiency, would continue to emerge. The original currency's position as first mover gave it advantages in recognition and network effects, but whether those advantages would prove durable remained to be seen. Privacy enhancements might change how the system was used and perceived. Various technical approaches could strengthen anonymity, making it harder to trace transactions or link addresses to identities. These improvements would appeal to those who valued financial privacy, but would also intensify concerns about facilitating illegal activity. The tension between privacy as a right and transparency as a tool for law enforcement would continue to generate debate and shape the system's relationship with governments and regulators. The question of monetary policy, whether the fixed supply schedule was optimal or whether some flexibility might be beneficial, would persist. The algorithmic supply cap was fundamental to the system's design, one of its most celebrated features among supporters. But economic circumstances might arise where the inability to adjust supply seemed problematic, where deflation pressured debtors or hoarding reduced velocity. Whether the system would maintain its monetary rigidity or whether future versions might incorporate different supply mechanisms remained an open question, though any such change would require consensus that seemed unlikely, given how central the fixed supply was to many participants' understanding of what made the system valuable. The environmental concerns about energy consumption would drive innovation or adaptation. Mining might shift increasingly to renewable sources, might utilize energy that would otherwise be wasted, might cluster in locations where cheap, sustainable power was abundant. Alternative consensus mechanisms that didn't require proof of work might gain traction, offering similar security properties with drastically reduced energy requirements. Or the system might simply continue as it was, with participants accepting the energy cost as a reasonable price for the security and decentralization it provided. Educational challenges would remain significant. Using the system safely required understanding concepts foreign to most people's experience with money: cryptographic keys, transaction confirmation, irreversibility, wallet security. As long as the learning curve remained steep, adoption would be limited to those willing to invest effort in education or willing to trust intermediaries who manage the complexity on their behalf. Better tools, clearer documentation, more intuitive interfaces could lower these barriers, but some irreducible complexity seemed inherent to a system where users directly controlled their assets without institutional intermediaries. Cultural and generational shifts might prove more important than technical developments. A generation growing up with digital native experiences, comfortable with virtual assets, accustomed to peer-to-peer systems, might find the currency more natural than those whose intuitions about money were formed in an earlier era. As wealth transferred generationally, as younger people gained economic power, their different relationship to technology and trust might accelerate adoption or shift how the system was used and valued. The system might fragment into distinct use cases, each emphasizing different properties. Some might use it primarily as a store of value, digital gold held long-term and rarely transacted. Others might use it for censorship-resistant payments, for moving value across borders, for preserving wealth in unstable regions. Still others might treat it as a speculative asset, trading frequently in pursuit of returns. The same underlying technology could serve all these purposes simultaneously, with different communities of users focusing on the aspects most relevant to their needs. Institutional adoption would change the system's character in ways difficult to predict. Large financial institutions managing significant holdings would demand different infrastructure, different security practices, different regulatory clarity than individual enthusiasts. Their participation might increase liquidity and stability, but might also introduce new risks: concentration of holdings, correlation with traditional markets, vulnerability to institutional failures. The influx of institutional capital could drive prices higher, while potentially reducing the system's independence from traditional finance. The possibility of failure or obsolescence couldn't be dismissed. A fundamental flaw in the cryptography, a breakthrough in quantum computing that undermined the security assumptions, a superior alternative that attracted users away. Any of these could render the system obsolete or valueless. The probability of such events seemed low, given how long the system had operated and how much scrutiny it had received. But the non-zero possibility reminded participants that confidence in the system's future required ongoing validation, not just faith in past performance. The philosophical questions would outlast any particular technical implementation. What money should be, who should control it, how financial privacy balanced against social goods, whether decentralization was achievable or even desirable. These debates would continue regardless of how this specific system evolved. The experiment had demonstrated that alternatives to traditional financial infrastructure were technically possible, that different design choices enabled different properties and served different values. Whether the particular combination of properties this system offered would prove durably valuable, whether other combinations might serve better, remained to be discovered through the ongoing experiment of use and adaptation. The future, like the past, would be written one block at a time, one transaction at a time, through millions of individual decisions about whether to use the system, how to improve it, what purposes to put it to. The uncertainty was inherent, built into a system designed to operate without central planning or control. The story wasn't finished because there was no endpoint at which it would be complete, only continuous evolution shaped by the interplay of technology, economics, culture, and the unpredictable choices of participants worldwide. The experiment continued, its outcome still unfolding, its ultimate significance still unknown. And so, the narrative of this assembly comes to its quiet conclusion. Whether you are still awake, or whether you have already drifted into a deep and peaceful sleep, know that you are exactly where you need to be. The world is vast, but tonight, its systems are simply the backdrop to your rest. Thank you for joining me here at Quietly Made. Rest now. Join us again tomorrow. Good night.